Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Well, my New Year's resolution was to get out of my quarantine boredom with eating and go back to making myself a healthy, homemade meal in the evenings. Y'all, I have been so bad. Let me tell you how bad I've been. I've been spending my grocery money on DoorDash. Yes, I have. Now I'm finished with that mess. It's a new year. I'm going to cook. You may have noticed I've been posting more videos, and that's because I'm cooking. So I found a great deal on a little pack of pork slices. They were labeled as country pork loin ribs. I don't know why. There's no bone in them. They're just nice lean pieces of pork loin. 5 of them for $2.32. So I didn't ask any more questions. And I'm going to show you how I made 5 meals. 1 for me, 4 for the freezer, for about $1 a meal. DoorDash can't beat that. Let's get cooking. And here are the pieces of pork that were labeled as country pork loin ribs. And you know, you can do this with any meat you have. You could do it with chicken. You could do it with regular pork chops. As I say, I got these for $2.32. So I'm using these. Let me just say real quickly, if you like our videos, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Click that little bell in the top right. So let's go over the ingredients. I've got some salt and baking powder there. I've got flour back here. My flour is all-purpose. I really want self-rising, so I'm going to make self-rising. I've got some vegetable broth here. You can use chicken broth. I've got 3 cups of croutons. I've got a little thyme here. I've got a small stick of celery. It's about a half a stick. It was the last little piece of celery in my package. I have a half a bell pepper here. I'm going to use half of that. And I've got 1 medium-sized onion. I've got some sprigs of rosemary and sage that I just picked out of my garden. Pay no attention to those 2 spice bottles. I'm not using them. I just didn't put them away from my last project. A word about the croutons. They're not really croutons. They're from a package of Pepperidge Farm stuffing, because that's what I had. I'm going to start out by making some self-rising flour. I like to use self-rising flour to dredge meat because the baking powder is a tenderizer and because self-rising flour has salt. So to make self-rising flour, you take 2 cups of all-purpose flour, you add 1 tablespoonful of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, and I use kosher salt, and you sift them together. In this case, I'm going to stir them together with my fork. So I'm going to use this self-rising flour to dredge the meat, and I'm going to use it to make the gravy. So you won't see me salting as I go along, because between the broth and the self-rising flour, there'll be enough salt for most taste. I used to always keep self-rising flour in my kitchen, but I don't make biscuits enough anymore to make it worthwhile, so I just keep the all-purpose and mix it up when I need it. So that's mixed up nicely, and now I'm going to dredge the meat in this self-rising flour. I did pat these little pieces of meat dry, so not a lot of the flour is going to stick to them, but it'll be enough to help tenderize them and to help get a little browning on them. Now, we're not going to fully fry these. We're just going to sear them a little bit. Now, just in case you're not familiar with the term dredge, and there are always some newbies watching videos, dredging is to just run them through the flour just to get a little bit of flour on them, as opposed to breading them, which would mean dipping them in a liquid before you dip them in the flour, as opposed to battering them, which would mean that you dip them down into a very liquid batter. Dredging is basically just to make sure that the surface of your meat is dry so that it browns nicely. So when I get these dredged, I'm going to meet you at the stove. Here you see my favorite skillet. This is a 10-inch Griswold. I have no idea how old it is, but I'm pretty sure it's approaching 100 years old. Looks like new, doesn't it? Looks better than new. I'm going to add about a quarter, maybe a little more than a quarter inch of grapeseed oil to sear these pieces of pork. Let me mention here that for frying I use grapeseed oil or sunflower oil, or in some cases lard. I never use any oil that's canola or corn. I do use olive oil, extra virgin, but not for frying. It's really not for frying. So I have this on medium heat, and I didn't measure it because I'm going to cook in it first, and the food will absorb some of the oil. But when I get ready to make the gravy, which is really a sauce velouté, I'll take out all but a half cup of the oil. So I have a little camera malfunction here, so I'll explain to you what I just did. I checked my temperature by dropping a little bit of the flour in, and I got a nice sizzle. So I have put the 5 pieces of pork in the hot oil. So I know hot's a generic term, and you didn't see a thermometer or anything. So in cooking in cast iron, I set my heat to medium and drop a bit of food in it. And if I get a sizzle but no burning, my temperature is right. If you want to use a thermometer, that's about 325 degrees. But that's kind of hard to do when you have just a little oil in the pan. It's not deep enough to really get a good temperature reading. A common mistake folks make when frying in cast iron is they have their heat too high. So I rarely cook at a temperature over medium temperature. I may go medium high if I'm putting a lot of volume in the pan, because that'll pull your temperature down. So if you often are getting things stuck on your cast iron skillets, it may not be the fault of the skillet. It might be that you have your heat too high. So I'm going to do a little time lapse here and brown this meat all the way around. So I turned these after about a minute and a half. It may have gone 2 minutes on the first side, and then about a minute on the other side, and I'm going to flip them up to sear the edges. If you're just using flat pork chops, you won't do that step, but I want to get just a little browning on all 4 sides. And here's the last turn. So they've had just a little bit of browning on all sides. Altogether, these have cooked about 5 minutes. So they're half done, maybe a little bit over half done. Then I'm going to take them up and put them on a plate I have over here. So right into the same oil, still on medium heat, I'm going to put my veggies. There's my onion, it's a quarter of a big pepper, and about my little piece of celery, the fresh sage and rosemary, about a tablespoonful of each. And I'm going to drop that down in there, and we get a little sizzle, but it's not burning, so the temperature is about right. And I'm just going to put all that in there, and I'm going to let it sizzle on this medium, it's a little under medium heat, until the onions are translucent. Now I realized in reviewing this footage that I didn't show, after I cook these, when they get to the point where the onions are translucent, I'm going to drain off all except a half cup of the oil. And then I'm going to make a sauce velouté, which most folks would call gravy. And I'm going to take a little while to show you this and explain it. I'm adding a half cup of flour to the half cup of oil and the vegetables. Now this is the place in a lot of recipes where it says add 1 can condensed mushroom soup or 1 can condensed celery soup. I have about 400 cooking videos and I don't think you've ever seen a can of condensed soup in any of my recipes. And any recipe you have that says add a can of condensed soup can be converted to a from scratch recipe using this method. And hey, be clear, I'm not ragging on you if you want to use a can of soup. You go right ahead. But if you don't, this is how you don't. So I'm going to stir that together and let it cook for just a few minutes, maybe 3 minutes, just to get a tiny bit of color. You do want to stir it as you go, and that will cook off any of the pasty flavor you might get from adding flour. And then we're going to add our broth. It's a whole quart of broth. This is how you figure your proportion. Half cup fat, half cup flour, added together equals 1 cup. Multiply that by 4 cups. That's how much liquid you use. If you want to make it creamy, in another recipe, not this one, we don't want cream in this one, you would substitute cream for half of your broth. So you want to add your liquid slowly. It's also key here to prevent lumps that your liquid be room temperature or cooler. Right out of the fridge is fine. So I whisk as I add the liquid until I get the whole quart of liquid in. And that's the end of the broth there. As I say, if you want this creamy, and you can, just substitute part of the broth with milk or cream. So I'm going to stir to make sure there's no lumps. And if you've used a cold liquid into the hot roux mixture, you won't have lumps. Then I'm going to add the 3 cups of croutons or bread cubes or stuffing packaged or whatever you choose to use. And we're going to stir that all together. And yes, my 10-inch skillet is absolutely slap full. But I promise it's not going to overflow. Now I'm going to put the little seared pieces of pork down into this dressing and gravy. We have to call it what it is. And we're going to finish cooking it on top of the stove in liquid, because this is pretty liquidy, on very low heat like a braise. So your pork is over half done. So we're going to cover it and set our timer for 30 minutes on the lowest heat and let it finish cooking. And I'll check it after about 15 minutes just to make sure that everything's perking along okay. I'll be back. So it's been about 15 minutes. I'm going to take the lid off and check it and just make sure that that pork is down under the dressing and gravy. What we want here is the effect of having dressing and gravy with our pork, but it's all cooked together in this one pan. I'm going to put the lid back on and I'll come back when it's done. Time's up. Dinner's done. This smells wonderful. I'm going to plate this up and show you what we got. Now this looks out of focus, but it isn't. That's the steam coming off of it. Now the texture of this is soft, like dressing with gravy on it. And I'm going to serve it with some cranberry sauce with some steamed veggies on the side. I figure this is 5 servings, unless of course you have somebody with a big appetite who wants to have 2 pieces of meat. But for me, this is 4 meals in the freezer, so no DoorDash in the foreseeable future. So this is all ready for dinner. Let me give you a little broader view there. We've got a pork chop. I don't care if they call it a loin country rib. It's a pork chop. But I'm thinking the next time I do this, I'm going to do it with a boneless, skinless chicken thigh or chicken breast. But I want you to look at that meat. I'm never sure what you can see on these videos, but that is some moist pork. I have heard people complain that when they cook pork loin, it's often dry. This is not dry. And if you have a pork loin that you want to slice up and cook this way, you won't be disappointed. That braise at the end, and that's basically what we were doing, was braising the pork. And the little baking powder that we put in the flour for the dredge has really made a nice and tender and moist piece of meat. And this is my dressing and cranberry sauce, which is one of my weaknesses, I have to say. If, like me, you're struggling with quarantine eating, or if you're just tired of cooking the same thing over and over, this is a cheap and easy way to perk up the menu. I'm pretty happy with it. I hope you try this, and I hope you like it as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.